Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to welcome you to the next in our series of events for the core project on corruption and patronage for this year at the Harriman Institute. Tonight we are being video recorded, so I would just remind everyone that any remarks that are made are on the record. We will be broadcasting this on our website once the processing is done by the university. But it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel tonight, which will be discussing what happens to patronage links at a time of social change. And we're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel of guests, and I will be introducing each of them in turn. I think the order that we're going to go in is speaking about Russia first, then about Central Asia, and then giving the Middle East a comparative perspective on things. So first, I'm delighted to introduce Gulnaz Sharafuddinova. Did I do that right? Is that absolutely good? Okay. Who is an associate professor at Miami University of Ohio. She did her undergraduate work in international relations at Florida International University and earned an MA and PhD from George Washington University. Her interests are in political economy, informal institutions, and legitimacy issues related to authoritarianism and democratization. Her book, The Political Consequences of Crony Capitalism Inside Russia, was published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2011, and she's had articles published in Comparative Politics and Publius, among others. And she received the Ed Hewitt Policy Fellowship from the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, and her research has also been sponsored by IREX, among others. So, Gulnaz, take it away.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So my conversation today, my talk today is more of a narrative. You don't expect a lot of slides here, but I did put up one interesting one for you to observe if you get bored. And my talk will consist of three parts to give you a little structure there. I'll start with something unusual for me. It would be complaining, but complaining in intellectual sense, complaining about intellectual discourses that we operate within. I will follow up with discussion, observations about the nature of informal networks that operate in Russia, and some disagreements that have been voiced that could be observed in the observations of various scholars who study Russia and Russian networks, and my own view on that. And I will, the last substantive part of my talk would be about the role of informal networks and the issue of regime stability, stability or destabilizing the regime. So starting with my complaint, which sort of emerged as I was looking into some of the justifications for the choices of terms that I made in my own book. Just this morning, I thought I would share it with you. I think one of the big issues in social science today, and especially in political science, is the fact that we rely on concepts that have been developed based on the description of specific type of societies, and particularly Western societies, right? So some foundational concepts in political science are state, democracy, capitalism. The concepts that have emerged through the study of what was going on in the Western societies. Now, these concepts became sort of predominant, and we use them to study many societies, other societies. And one of the consequences of such usage is that when we apply these concepts to other societies, we always have to qualify these concepts and always have to look for some attributes that are lacking, that there is a gap, that something is lacking when we apply the concept to a non-Western society. I'll just illustrate this with very recent examples. Maybe a week or two ago, as I'm reading the news on Russia, I see an interview in Snob magazine with Bill Browder, a well-known businessman, many of you know.
He was here in the fall for this series.
Very interesting. who gives an interview to Masha Gessen, and the big headline, "There is no state in Russia," Bill Browder says. Okay, I note that. I like these interesting headlines. A couple of days later, this is just within the last 10 days, I'm reading the news. A couple of days later, I read a commentary in Vedomosti by Ella Paneach. She works for the European University in St. Petersburg. There is no state in Russia. right? Okay. Now, this is just to demonstrate the description of Russia's realities through a lack, right? That there is no state, right? Do we have concepts to describe what is there? Obviously, they do not mean that there is a void, right? There are institutional structures and governing structures that exist there, okay? Well, there are scholars who come up with new concepts, and when we think about Russian state, there are concepts such as mafia state, bandit state, network state, network authoritarianism, but it still is the state, right? Another example, capitalism. And this is where my complaint started from. I'm reading my own book, which I don't do usually, but I'm like, okay, I should probably know what I wrote there because it was written a while ago. And my own justification for why I use the term crony capitalism and the way I define it, and like you can find it on page like 10 or something. I define crony capitalism, so there is capitalism, and I say, well, and I am the scholar who tries to study Russian political economic system on its own terms without hopefully relying on the Western concepts, and I'm defining crony capitalism as a system which lacks rule of law, which lacks private property or private property protection. Again, lack, right? So think about democracy and all the adjectives, right? So there is just a structural problem in the intellectual discourse of, dealing with non-Western societies and using concepts that have been developed in looking into the Western developments. And perhaps it's just an opening remark to get you thinking about it and maybe provoke a little discussion on it. What could be done? What should be done? There is obviously some kind of, dominance exists. Could something be done? Is it, if it's not a state, there is, okay, North Weingast, natural state versus more modern state. What can we do? I think there is a problem out there, and to the extent that I'm trying to be cognizant of it, I don't really have the tools, right? Because still there is a concept of democracy, there is still a concept of capitalism, and there's still a concept of state that I have to rely on. I cannot get away from it. So we are in a way bound in this framework. Okay, so that's my complaint. I want to get out of this framework. Okay, is it possible, right? Okay. So coming back to the issue of the Russian state, and my own empirical work in Russian regions, based on Russian regions, brought my attention to the importance of informal networks. I've even tried to create a new concept, economic political networks, informal networks. I call them EPNs. And I was studying these EPNs in the early 2000s, at the time when transitology paradigm was already sort of over, and we needed something new. And so, but people studied political parties, people studied individual voting behavior and individual strategies for elections, etc. I decided to study these informal networks, and I should say that it was on the regional level. Most people looking into the Russian national developments in the early 2000s were making distinctions between liberal and Siloviki blocs in Russian politics. This was the early, Putin era, when the biggest cleavage was seen as the cleavage between the liberals, Gref and Chubaises and Medvedevs, and the Siloviki bloc that Putin represented as well. And now, since then, since the early 2000s, there has been a lot of research done, and to bring attention to the network-based system of operation of Russian elites. So by now, by 2012, 2011, we have actually plenty of scholars and commentators that look at the network-based structure of elites. There is work by Marina Litvinovich, who she's not a scholar. She worked for Gleb Pavlovsky's Foundation for Effective Politics, and she was involved in presidential administration work in the early 2000s, but since then she moved to opposition and established an organization of her own, which in preparation for elections to 2011 and 2012 brought up a lot of empirics about family connections and how they matter both for the states and for the businesses. So, you know, you can go into, I think there's a specific site, and you can go and study, you know, how Yakunin, the chief of the Russian railroad system, what his sons, how his sons are benefiting from, you know, the work of Yakunin, and a lot of this, you know, informal personal relations-based connections that she was able, and people that work for her were able to find through open source resources. There is work by Sam Green. Most recently, I remember his paper on political economy of cash flows that also studies networks connecting key businesses and political elites. And most recently, there is work by Minchenko Consulting, right, sort of a think tank consulting firm in Moscow, that came up with the really well-discussed, well-debated concept of Politburo 2, the top of the Russian elite right now, at the beginning of Putin's term, that sort of looks, you know, at key central figures, each of them having networks of their own, and also groups of people that are candidates to become members of the Politburo. These are seen as the most influential people, and, you know, although it's considered a Politburo, it's not. They are not members of some, you know, institutionalized structure in the state. They all represent either businesses or various parts of the state, and it's not that they meet, but, you know, these are seen as sort of key individuals who help, or along with Putin, govern Russia or become key players in decision-making process. The presence of these networks, or this research, different types of research that I've mentioned, and the recognition of the central role and coexistence of networks with the state institution, this recognition at least, you know, gave me a hope that, okay, my research is not outdated at all, and the direction that I went into has been really supported by other scholars and other research that exists out there. When we think about the type of governance that depends on informal personal networks, you know, this is not the first time that scholars are studying it, and in the 60s there was a lot of scholars studying issues related to political patronage, and we can look at the relationships that exist within these networks as type of patronage-based links and patronage-based relationships. Now, the difference with the 60s and the theories of modernization is that in the 60s, the political patronage type structures were seen as something that will pass, right? That's something that are temporary and sort of a stage of development. And I think by now, if we have learned anything, is that the reliance on this type of governance structures could be seen as, you know, suboptimal yet equilibrium. That there are certain reinforcing features that will keep these structures, you know, going. And so there is obviously a need not to look at these structures as passing, but there is a need to study how such polities operate. And you know, that's, you know, just in a couple of minutes, I'll talk about the way that I studied it, looking into Russia, and the arguments that I've arrived at. There is a debate about the nature of informal networks that exist in Russia. One view considers the networks to be more or less stable. So when we look at Putin's networks, frequently, you know, his basis is seen through concentric circles, which is pretty stable, KGB-based circle, St. Petersburg-based circle, you know, the Ozero Co-op-based circle of people that are linked to him. So usually it's seen as more or less stable structures that operate and that affect decision making. There are also more or less stable regional structures, political machines that have been built in the 1990s that have been dismantled through Putin's reforms or during the 2000s, but they could be seen as more or less stable. There are also networks based on state corporations. I mentioned the Russian railroad system, Rosneft, Gazprom-based, Rostechnology-based networks. They are usually seen as pretty stable. There is another view, and here Sam Green's research is, I think, proponent of that, which looks at the more fluid nature of informal networks and sort of looks at them as changing strategic alliances where people come together in pursuit of a specific goal. Say there is a privatization of a specific big enterprise, and members of various networks could come together in the pursuit of that particular goal. I don't particularly remember Sam's. I think he also analyzed the debate about the entry of Russia into the WTO and how the issue of that entry and the extent to which that would hurt or advantage specific types of businesses also created a basis for building these strategic networks in pursuit of either promoting or creating disruptions towards that goal. In my own, and then we've mentioned research. If you sort of see his other slides, there is some fluidity, that there is change in individuals that that come to the top or that become members of the network. I think I remember Shoigu sort of was. So there is some movement going on, and in that sense, it's not as stable. It's not as stable as, for example, family-based networks that exist in Central Asia. Perhaps I would probably think that when we talk about stability or lack of stability of various networks, we can really think about different types of networks that exist. And in that sense, my own opinion would be that there is truth both to the fact that there is some degree of stability, but there are also networks that come together for strategic purposes. I'm trying to say that there is a variety of those, right? There are family-based networks that are very stable, where father-son relationship or other relatives come into play, and that that become important players. So in that sense, I take that sort of a more diverse approach on that without making it a big point of confrontation, whether it's these networks or those networks. I think there is place for all kinds of networks there. Let me now look at the role of informal networks for stabilizing or destabilizing the regime. Now, there is research accumulating on the Russian state that theorizes how informal networks aid governance. Because usually we always look at informal personal relationships as, again, lacking formality and being suboptimal, and yet currently there is more and more research that looks at the more functionalist, instrumentalist view of these networks. Sam Green, once again, points out at the intentional deinstitutionalization as a tool for the regime to maintain uncertainty, and uncertainty as a control mechanism for those who write the rules. So if you have a deinstitutionalized sphere and you keep guessing most people as to which rule will be played out, it gives you a lot of control. So it's sort of a very intentional mechanism of control, right? So in that sense, again, it's a governing tool in a way. This book that I think I showed to you, Russia as a Network State, recently published by Kononenko, it's an edited volume, also tries to engage this functionalist, instrumentalist view of networks and look at how, at how networks help things happen. Right? That, okay, if in Russia we have the situation when state institutions do not work, but, okay, country somehow stays together and at least some policies are implemented, what works? And so their point of view is that through networks, elites make things happen. So it's sort of this optimistic view that, again, networks as a source of governance. In my own research, to confirm, at least to give one example of this, I've studied a couple of years ago the intergovernmental conflict over regional property when Putin decided that some regions that own things, big pieces like diamond companies like Alrosa, should not own them and they should be federalized. My own research brought indeed sort of the types of individuals that usually you would not expect in terms of participating in the process of federalization. The type of individuals that were engaged were not necessarily, state-appointed individuals from Rosgosimущество that would be, going through specific institutionalized mechanisms of changing the property relationship, but it did involve finding informal links and people who could first convince the governor of Yakutia, but then convince the deputies of the Yakutia's parliament in making specific changes, right? So the legal process has to be observed, but in order to observe it, you need still to convince people, and that convincing part involved people that otherwise might not have any relation to that. So the goal of federalization of Alrosa, the diamond firm, at least in my observation, did involve reliance on informal networks. So in that sense, okay, they had it done. They were able to federalize and change those structures, but how did they do it? There was a combination of informal and formal mechanisms used. So in that sense, yes, we could see this sort of a functional or instrumental purpose behind informal networks. Usually, besides the issue of this instrumental use and how they could aid in governing, I think there is an issue of political stability that is important to look at. Usually when we look at the use of patronage, personal relationships, we are thinking about systems that are unstable. I think that's sort of the predisposition that exists. Recently, there has been, again, studies, and I noted in CPS there was a study by Leonardo Ariola on Africa that was making a point that political patronage could be used to stabilize political system. And in my book, also, I address the issue of political stability and how informality affects stability depending on other political institutions. I used Bob Lieberman's conception of looking into the political economy as an institutional order with different types of institutions coexisting and sometimes clashing together with each other. And to me, it was sort of this, lightning or enlightenment moment when I saw, oh, okay, exactly, this fits really well. I'm looking into the formal institutions, elections, and I'm looking into the informal institutions, these EPNs, economic political networks, and I saw how they coexist really difficult when you had competitive politics in Russia in the 90s. And for me, it was two regions. One was competitive and one was non-competitive. Both of them were based on informal governing networks, but one of the regions was based on a centralized informal network. The other region it had competing networks. And it was in the system with the competing networks where elections were conducted in extremely dirty ways with a lot of manipulation, a lot of compromat, a lot of negative information and actions sort of spilling over onto the public. And it was from Nizhny Novgorod, which was that region, that you had questions to Putin at the press conference about abolishing elections. And it was in Tatarstan, the other region, where there was everything really neatly centralized and no competition really spilled over and things were really controlled and managed. These observations led me to think that openly, publicly contested public arena really clashes with the crony capitalist informal network-based governance and is really unstable. That there will be that there is this structural tendency towards centralization, and that was my explanation for why Putin's regime emerged as a more centralized system that sort of banished public politics and that allowed or erected methods of controlling elections and outcomes of elections, and achieved a certain degree of stability. If I have another minute, I will just address one last question about a new issue now, under which conditions such system could get destabilized. And I'm talking now about the centralized system that emerged under Putin, and how long the inclusive network, pretty inclusive network, so Putin is on the top as a moderator, the inclusive network built under Putin for the elites could persist, and what are the weak points. And I just here will propose some speculative ideas. Number one, that the role of economic growth and expanding pie or shrinking pie will affect the degree of stability of the system, because it's easy to maintain amicable, manageable relationship when the economic pie is expanding. The conflicts might exacerbate, tighten, spill over if the economic pie is shrinking. So that's sort of one idea. I would, though, also point out the opposite idea of the paradoxical effect that economic growth could play because of the expansion of the middle class, which I think is one of the prominent explanations for the political protests in 2011-2012, when, as a result of this fat 2000 years in Russia and the growth of the middle class that had access to travel, that became more cosmopolitan and faced state institutions that were very different from Russia's state institutions, that went to the streets to actually ask for a different type of governance. So economic growth, on the one hand, enables stability of the elite. On the other hand, again, just a modernization argument, middle classes. And another well-known point about the difficulty of the power succession in such personalistic regimes when the role of the arbiter is associated with one person. And that is one potential destabilizing point. And I would add to that also an appearance of a credible and charismatic opposition leader that can lead the middle classes or the discontented masses, that I think has been absent so far. And so the role of individual in history I do believe in. So I would say that, if there is such person that emerges, that also is a wild card. Thank you for your attention. I'll stop at that.
Okay. Thank you. I need my cheat sheet back.
You can pass it down to us again.
Okay. Thanks, Gulnaz. On to Scott Radnitz, who's an associate professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies and the director of the Ellison Center for Russian, East European, and Central Asian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. His interests include social mobilization, informal politics, and authoritarianism. He earned his undergraduate degree in political science from Berkeley and his PhD at MIT, and he held a postdoc at Harvard's Belfer Center. His book, Weapons of the Wealthy, Predatory Regimes and Elite-Led Protests in Central Asia, was published by Cornell University Press in 2010. His articles have been published in Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Democracy, and Europe-Asia Studies, among other places, and he has grants from the National Science Foundation and the Department of Homeland Security, IREX, and the Kennan Institute, among others. So,
I'm going to agree with Gulnaz on most things. We're actually very simpatico, even though we didn't coordinate in advance. Honestly, you'll see that we have a lot of things in common. So, and this might be because in the regions where we work, all three of us actually, politics outside informal institutions is the norm. And sometimes this is hard for our colleagues who study Europe and the United States to grasp. And so here I share Gulnaz's complaint that political science traditionally treats informal things as an afterthought. Political science is very good at snapshots and institutional outcomes and not so good at process. In the regions where we work, some politics does indeed happen within formal institutions according to the intended rules. That is, things like elections, parties, legislatures, and bureaucracy. but much also happens either in violation of these rules or outside of these institutions. So recently in political science, there is some new research being done, some articles and some edited volumes about informal and formal institutions. And I think this is a good step forward, but it's more of a beginning than an end. Because this line of research still starts from the presumption of formality, and it asks mostly how informal practices disrupt or distort or somehow change formal outcomes. And this kind of thinking, I think, works pretty well in emerging democracies, weakly institutionalized democracies, not so well in mostly authoritarian countries, although this might be debated. In the context where we work, Russia, Central Asia, the Middle East, I think many of us would argue that informal institutions are the primary driver of various outcomes that we care about in political science, including the nature of governance, conflict or stability, political economy, and the role of the state in society. So I think despite this, there's also sort of an emerging research agenda bubbling up, and might not yet be identified as such, that does treat informality as central. And there are some younger scholars, mostly younger scholars, some middle-aged scholars, who look at how power is organized broadly and how that intersects with the state. A lot of this research takes place in the former Soviet Union, and there's a reason for that. This region is actually a very good laboratory for identifying informal structures and how that interacts with the state. Informality was rife in the Soviet Union as a way for people to circumvent a very top-heavy bureaucracy. And the major institutional change, the collapse of the Soviet Union, followed by the superficial transplantation of new formal institutions from the outside, led to various kinds of adaptations in which people tried to survive or get ahead using whatever means were available. And so you ended up with a lot of very interesting informal innovations. So now I'm going to talk about some regularities that stand out in the post-Soviet world that I think are well addressed through an emphasis on informal institutions. Not that these things are necessarily unique to the region, but I think are most identified with the former Soviet Union. So here are some of the striking regularities that I see. One is that even 20 years after the collapse, you still see a continuity of political practices and the recurring appearances of networks. And this is despite many external and internal shocks that could have or should have disrupted these old patterns, including globalization, the rise of a middle class, the free movement of people. Nonetheless, you see these old patterns persist. A second feature is that regimes in the region tend to cycle between consolidated pyramids of power and decentralized and dispersed authority. And the third feature is that social forces periodically assert themselves and challenge governments only to return to dormancy for long periods of time. So for each of these three things, there's a story to tell that involves politicians, elections, voters, and interest groups, all the conventional stuff. But there's also a parallel informal dimension. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think an approach attuned to informal networks, institutions, and practices can be valuable in helping to make sense of these things. So I started off very broad, but now I'm going to focus more closely on particular cases with an emphasis on Central Asia because that's my role in this panel. So I find the rise of Putin and the Putin regime very puzzling, and even more puzzling than it's been treated. For a long time, the study of Russia in political science involved the study of institutional design, party formation, partisanship, elections, constitutions, things that are typical of advanced democracies to which many people assumed or hoped that Russia was heading. With the rise of Putin, there came a new cohort into power, and the opposition was neutralized, and the new cohort appropriated institutions and changed them. And this was mostly unanticipated by most scholars in the 1990s. So given the old trend of the way the region was studied, I think what's been going on now for over a decade, is a completely different paradigm, and yet it hasn't fully been treated as such. There have been studies in the Putin era of analysis of elite data, for example, gathering data on who's in power now, where they came from, and how they're connected. There's also been a lot of discussion documenting the formal measures that Putin has taken to centralize power. But I think there's a lot more that hasn't been discussed or researched. So one lesson from this particular case is that 20 years later, influential networks do not die easily. Instead, even if they're removed from power, they can conceal themselves and adapt and provide their members with self-help. And sometimes they return to power during moments of institutional weakness. So I think a key question that's not fully answered is to what extent networks that are out of power can still maintain cohesion as networks, based on various kinds of things: regional affiliation or kinship, or organized criminal ties, or some other organizational identity. So the fact is, we see strangely familiar modes of governing in various post-Soviet countries time and again. In Ukraine, after a second moment of major institutional change, the Orange Revolution, there was a great euphoria that this was the breakthrough that would lead to a completely different kind of politics, one that was more familiar and favorable to us in the West. But Yanukovych in 2010 was elected democratically and decided to govern in a different fashion than either his predecessor or as most in the West would like. He rewarded his base of oligarchs from his native region, harassed journalists, and imprisoned his chief rival in politics. In Central Asia, Soviet elite networks asserted themselves immediately in the early phase of post-communism and had very little trouble consolidating power because there was little opposition. In Georgia and Azerbaijan, initially there was a democratic and nationalist mobilization that produced a new cohort of leaders with popular support. But these countries got involved in wars, which led to a vacuum of power, which was then filled by more skilled old regime elites who then created their own regimes. So in Azerbaijan, a democratic, very strong nationalist named Abulfaz Elchibey, here he is on the left, held democratic elections, which were in a moment of chaos during the war with Armenia, won by Haidar Aliyev, who was the old party boss of the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic, head of the KGB, and a member of the Politburo in the Soviet Union. Aliyev came back to power, restored his old network, which consisted of reliable and competent people who knew how to run a state, and therefore helped Aliyev to consolidate an authoritarian regime, which continues up to today with his son as president. In Russia, arguably, the restoration of this old guard was delayed by a decade. And Putin, like these other actors, restored power through a dominant party that was centered on many of his old cronies, and some have argued, like Gulnaz has mentioned, is centered on the security services, the Siloviki, although that's debated. So in all these cases, the dominant approach to explaining how these things have happened, at least in political science, is to see these restorations of old networks and old practices as a failure of democracy, as backsliding toward authoritarianism. But you could also see this as the success and endurance of various collectivities that otherwise were weakened and out of power. So it's an interesting question. How did security service networks or other kinds of networks endure and adapt outside of power until they were able to come back in? And it's a sociological question, actually, that looks at the informal sources of power and the roots of collective action. A second post-Soviet phenomenon is about regime construction, consolidation, and decline. So the concept of pyramids has been used to describe this in the region. And here's also an incidental connection with the Middle East. So the idea is that in these countries that are weakly institutionalized, the ruler, who is the president, sits at the pinnacle of a web of patronage and manages resource flows from a wide base where low-level civil servants reside at the bottom and higher-level people are stacked up on top. So power is exercised through the single pyramid in a system of one-man rule, or in some cases through a multiple period system if power is divided for any reason, in which competition then occurs among several equally powerful figures. So I think this is a useful concept that captures the realities of informality and power. But I also think it can be modified and extended further, because the concept of pyramids masks important variation of stuff that's going on inside the pyramid. For example, individual elites who are in the system are not necessarily fully loyal to the president, even if they're incorporated into the pyramid. Instead, they probably maintain some allegiance to their cohort along horizontal lines. And there are also going to be power differentials between members of these different networks. Because when a ruler builds the pyramid, they don't eliminate all opposition through repression or exile or something else, something worse. Instead, they co-opt potential opposition and make them into temporary supporters and then absorb them into the larger system. But people within the pyramid don't lose old allegiances. So a better concept might be to think of pyramids within pyramids, or perhaps a different shape altogether. So you might think of shapes that are drawn differently, that represent different distributions of power. For example, an upside-down umbrella. This would represent one leader and undifferentiated masses. Or, like an age distribution diagram, you could have a fat middle, which represents a pacted coalition of multiple power brokers who have roughly equal amounts of power. Of course, it's not enough simply to draw a system conceptually, but the next step would be then to identify these groups and to explain the dynamics of how they interact. So, as a case in point, you can look at Central Asian countries, which, according to the pyramid scheme, are all single pyramid regimes, right, with one powerful leader to whom everybody else is subordinate, and they're all authoritarian, right, according to a simple dichotomous schema, democratic or authoritarian. They're authoritarian single pyramid systems. But if you look within them, you can identify various kinds of actors that are engaged in various kinds of dynamics that are important. So take Uzbekistan, which is sort of the classic unitary pyramid with the great Khan at the top. But this model masks a lot of potential diversity within it. There's competition on the basis of region, which goes back to the pre-Russian Khanates, and it was institutionalized under the Soviet system. And today, recruitment into important ministries happens upon regional lines. So the Ministry of Internal Affairs is reputed to be staffed by people from Samarkand and Bukhara. The SNB, the former KGB, is reputed to be staffed by people from Tashkent. So there's this regional divide, which is sometimes could be tension, but there's this potential future split that could happen upon regional lines. And besides that, even in Uzbekistan, which is a state-controlled economy, you have oligarchic/criminal types who are very rich and who are temporarily at least aligned with the president and support him, but they also have vast amounts of wealth and power bases of their own, which could potentially be meaningful in politics in the future. In Kazakhstan, it's up here on the stamp, this also looks like a simple single pyramid regime, but because of Kazakhstan's early privatization and the dispersion of resources, very plentiful, lucrative resources because of energy, there's a wider array of players who have some stake and some power. These can be businessmen who benefited from privatization. Some of them are members of Nazarbayev's extended family, and these people have access to tremendous resources and also their own clienteles. In Tajikistan, represented here by Rahmon, because of the civil war, President Rahmon's pyramid does not extend throughout the entire country. It's of limited scope, and there are locally based power brokers who have their own webs of patronage in different parts of the country. So what's the advantage of making this pyramid concept more complex rather than keeping it as single pyramid versus multiple pyramids? I think there's two things. One is that this captures the actual politics that takes place under the surface. There is competition over resources, but it's not transparent, and it doesn't take place through parties and legislative factions. Instead, it takes place through these other agglomerations. And a second reason is that informality makes regimes vulnerable to instability. And knowing how these regimes are divided internally will help us to predict how they might break apart if and when the current system dissolves. And change is coming, sooner or later. At least these two guys, Nazarbayev and Karimov, are in their 70s and have been in power for over 20 years. The president of Turkmenistan passed away in 2006. When these guys pass, it's unclear what's going to happen, because while they're in power, the rules of the game are clear among elites. But there hasn't been any situation since they've been in power in which the current elites have had to try to work out distribution of resources and power among themselves. So when they leave, there might be more contentious forms of politics, and it would be useful to know along what lines that's going to happen, if it does. A third feature of the former Soviet Union that's worth noting is the periodic emergence of social forces or challenges to authority. And this also follows directly from the competition of power within pyramids that I just talked about. So we tend to see state building from the point of view of a leader who co-opts and brings power brokers into the system. But the subordinates who are on top of these mini pyramids are also network builders on their own, and they also seek opportunities to take advantage if there's some sort of institutional rupture. A case in point is Kyrgyzstan, which has always been the most raucous of the Central Asian states, where they've had some actual political change. So this is Melisbek Mirzakhmatov, who is the very powerful mayor of Osh. But the formal description of mayor doesn't come close to describing his actual relationship with the central government, nor the degree of control he has over Osh. And his story embodies the hazy boundary between informal networks and the state. So Mirzakhmatov himself emerged from the murky world of business and crime. He also worked in the tax agency and for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He's a very savvy player. He aligned himself with the former president, Bakiyev, between 2005 and 2010. He got himself appointed to mayor under Bakiyev. When Bakiyev was ousted in a somewhat violent coup, Mirzakhmatov resisted removal, even though the new government was trying to replace all of the Bakiyev appointees. And when violence broke out in Osh, Mirzakhmatov was still the last Bakiyev appointee remaining at the head of a region. So even without any kind of election or referendum or negotiated settlement, Mirzakhmatov managed to gain a degree of autonomy that far exceeded the powers that are envisioned by the Constitution. His local legitimacy today rests on discriminatory policies that violate national civil rights laws. The police in Osh commit systematic abuses against the minority ethnic Uzbek population, including arbitrary detention, extortion, and physical abuse. What makes Mirzakhmatov so powerful is that his regime guarantees economic protection and state employment for one ethnic group by excluding another. And Mirzakhmatov also has a web of associates that defend his interests in a kind of mini pyramid of his own in Osh. So how did Osh gain this de facto autonomy, which was also very unexpected? Even though Kyrgyzstan was always a weak state, at least the entire territory since the beginning was always under the de facto and de jure control of the central government. So the answer is that it has to do with networks and opportunities. When informality prevails as the rules of the game in a political system, bargains are struck and sometimes renegotiated when relative power changes. Local actors are always insecure, and they cope by forming networks that provide them some security. And when the institutional context changes and new opportunities arise, they can make a power grab. So how to describe this process depends on where you sit. From a state-centric perspective, the state partially eroded and lost its monopoly on violence throughout the country. From a bottom-up perspective, though, local actors asserted themselves through network building and successfully provided order to the local population without the need for a central state. So the point of all of this is that within a pyramid, you can see dynamic action. Power is always shifting, although it's not always visible to outsiders, and under the right circumstances, you can see new actors emerge in a visible way to make a greater claim for power. Because the rest of the post-Soviet region also is run on a similarly informal basis, what happened in Kyrgyzstan might potentially represent the future of Central Asia or even beyond. And there's a lot of speculation now about what Russia would look like without Putin, right? Or if Putin were either voted or booted out of office. A lot of people think there would be a reversion, decentralization of authority back to the governors who were powerful under Yeltsin before Putin came to power. So it's probably important to focus on the social sources of order, how power is built from the ground up. Typically, we look to the capitals first. We look at the president and we look at the president's team, and that's why there's a lot of focus on Putin. And Putin is a very important actor, don't get me wrong. But it's also worth looking a little bit deeper to identify local, informal, and charismatic forms of power that could potentially be the basis of a rival order that could assert itself and potentially coexist with a weaker central government in the future. And now to wrap up. If there is an emergent research agenda, and I think there is, and I hope to help it along, here's some questions that I think would be worth addressing to help understand countries like this better. How do informal institutions emerge and evolve? Like any kind of institution, they're not static, they're constantly changing, they're constantly being renegotiated. So how do you chart change in informal institutions where the changes are not written down on paper or on the internet? And to what extent do these informal institutions penetrate or emerge from within the state? So it would probably be incorrect to make a completely stark dichotomy between state and society or informal institutions and the state. The truth is they're in and around and sometimes come from them, come from the state or state agencies. So you have to look at how the two intersect. A second question is whether a particular informal institution or network strengthens or weakens incumbent power. The same practice in different contexts might have very different effects on the political system or political economy in a country. Clientelism could be regime strengthening or regime undermining, depending on who's practicing it, when, and where. Another question is about the scale of informal networks and institutions. Do the vehicles of collective action informally scale up easily into pyramids or some other large structure? But when do they remain locally rooted? And who are the actors that are able to connect multiple local informal structures to build up something bigger that looks kind of like a state or kind of like a regime? And this is an important question when politics becomes fluid. And then the last question, which I guess was also the one that was motivating scholars from the beginning of the post-communist era, is at what point do formal institutions take root and become primary and take over the functions that informal institutions were previously providing? So when does a formal structure take on life? When do people begin to actually obey the rules that are inherent in the formal institution? And this is the ultimate and trickiest question, which has not been answered yet. But it's still worth arguing that where formal institutions that function as they're supposed to are a long way off, and they probably are in many countries that we study, we should accept the current reality as it is and try to understand things on their own terms. Thanks.
And now moving on to the Middle East, Ellen Lust is an associate professor of political science at Yale. This year, she's a Strauss Fellow at the Strauss Institute for the Advanced Study of Law and Justice at New York University. She earned her MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. Her interests center on authoritarianism, elections, and development in the Middle East, and she has served as chair for the Council on Middle East Studies at Yale. She's the author or editor of 4 books, and most recently, the co-editor of Governing Africa's Changing Societies in 2009. 2012. Her articles have been published in Annual Review of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Comparative Politics, International Journal of Middle East Studies and Politics and Society, among others. She's written also for the Brookings Institution about first elections in the Middle East, and she is the founding associate editor of the journal Middle East Law and Governance. So, Ellen.
Thank you. I feel like this is going to take us in an entirely different direction, and I sort of apologize from the outset. It is not just because it's the Middle East, it's because perhaps actually at the moment, and this is a very odd thing for somebody who studies authoritarianism in what seemed like the most stable and unchanging region in the world for a very long time, I'm actually in this region where there's the most uncertainty at the moment. So I took a very different tack to the question at hand, which was really to think about the ways in which uncertainty is affecting clientelistic practices, and I'm doing it in the lens of elections because, frankly, that's what I know. Also because I think that they're an interesting way in thinking about how what we think of as, I want to define it in a bit more detail in a second, what sort of clientelistic practices have been the driving factor in elections, I would argue, in the past decades. And so the question is, to what extent has the changes and the transformations that are taking place either disrupted or reinforced or affected that? It gets to some of these questions about when do we think that these things actually really get changed. The work that I'm going to be presenting is part of actually two different but increasingly merging projects with other colleagues, just to be very clear and upfront about that. So the things I'll say about our work is coming from me, and so if there's sort of misconceptions, misconstrued, or if they ever say to you, she said what, then you'll know that that's entirely fair. But it's Lindsay Benstead at Portland State, it's Dafir Malouche, who's in a statistics department in Tunis, Gamel Sultana at the American University of Cairo in Egypt, and Jakob Wichmann, who's a Dane. So we are this, and Lindsay is Canadian, so we're this little international team that has come together and is working on understanding essentially elections and parties, and I actually work on social networks in Tunisia, Egypt, and actually Libya as well. So just to give you a sense again of how I've taken this question and what I want to do with it, the question I'm looking at is, how does uncertainty that's coming about in the Arab Spring affect clientelism? And before I go any further, I actually want to be really clear about how I think about clientelism, because it has become a sort of a concept, I think, that has become squished and morphed and done all sorts of things to it. So I'm not saying that mine is the best definition of it, or even that it is really sort of what some people would call clientelism, but it is what I will be talking about, so you should know how I'm defining it. So essentially, if you look at a lot of work currently on clientelism, it's getting boiled down to things like vote buying, sacks of grains being distributed, etc. I entirely reject that, by the way. I mean, that is, in my opinion, that's vote buying, and it's fine, but it's not what I think was essentially initially meant by clientelism. If you go back either to sort of the anthropological takes on it, or, of course, as his colleague, I will go back to James Scott. Then it was a patron-client relationship. It was uneven, it was unequal, but it was a relationship that actually had more endurability to it than a simply one-off, I'm buying your vote today. So that's the first distinction I want to make. The second, and here's where I would actually part ways somewhat with Jim Scott, is that he was distinguishing that from communalism. For him, they were two very different ideas. There was communalism, which was about your relations and your social relations with others, and your mutual identities were from the same group. And then there was clientelism, which was about this exchange relationship, right? I will agree with him that you can have clientelistic relationships that are not communal. I would disagree with him, or at least suggest that there's a sort of another way in which these relationships get formed, which is more of a sort of a communal clientelism, if you want to call it that way. But it's an idea that both the social relationships and an entire set of expectations and obligations that take place in the social sphere are combined with what then become these sort of exchange relationships that we think of in the political sphere. That's how I think about clientelism most of the time. So just so you're really clear about that. And then, of course, the question is, First of all, if we're looking at authoritarian regimes, to what extent was this part of what was taking place, and what was the relationship between clientelism when was vote buying taking place, and what did those elections mean? I've talked and written, I think, to a larger degree than many people would like on those issues. The second, then, of course, is in transitional elections, then what changes and what remains the same, and how should we understand then how people will engage in transitional elections? And the third point is just simply to think about a little bit about what this means in the future. Just very, very briefly, so you know what this is all being drawn from. Again, these aren't the only surveys we've been conducting, but the ones that will be used in this presentation are ones that come from Egypt, essentially in August of 2011, and then in May of 2012. We've actually just gotten another survey, post-election survey out of the field now. And in Tunisia, that was done September, October of 2012, as well as interviews, election observation, secondary sources, and sort of the usual stuff, shall we say. Before starting to think about what's taken place, the question is, of course, why should the Arab Spring matter, right? And maybe this seems obvious, but you think it's worth sort of stepping back and really being clear about what are the things that may have changed. The first one, of course, is that there's new entrants. People who couldn't run before, either because they were stopped by the state or because I would argue that everybody knew they wouldn't win even if they did run, suddenly can find themselves forming parties, entering, etc. Okay, so you get new candidates. You also now get an entire new set of voters, and I think we're often unclear about what the new voters are compared to the old ones. There's some ideas. These new voters are very different people. They're the people who sat it out before because they objected, or they're the people who weren't allowed to vote before, etc. So one of the things I'll be talking about in this presentation is that distinction. But we know that new people are essentially coming into the political sphere, and I look at parliamentary elections, right? And in contrast to what may happen in some of the presidential elections, in parliamentary elections, the vast majority of people did not vote in the pre-rupture period. So if we're looking at Egypt, it was about 20 to 25, and a really good year was in a good area and a good year, it was around 30% of the population decided to go out and vote. If you're talking about Tunisia, it was in the 50s. But it wasn't like everybody used to vote because they were all sort of beaten over the head and told that they had to do that. That wasn't what was taking place. And so given that, now there's a whole set of people who are coming into the system. The second thing, of course, is that in some ways, we've got new stakes, right? There's in many ways, the entire nature of the state is being drawn into question. And so there's a lot more taking place than what I would argue had taken place before, which was that this was about a competition over getting access, sort of a privileged access to resources. So there's a reason why people might think differently about engaging in elections. Even people who engaged in elections before might suddenly think that they're doing something different than they did the last time. And of course, on top of all of this, and this is where sort of uncertainty comes in, I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot of uncertainty, not only about what takes place at the voting booth, right, when you no longer are expected to show your ballot as you head up, in which of course you see a lot of people still trying to do this to make sure that it's clear they voted the quote-unquote right way. But there's a lot of uncertainty about, what really are the stakes and what really is the process. And this woman is actually a woman who was in Tunisia sitting outside the polls, but she's here in part to remind me of women in Egypt when this was after the parliamentary elections and before the presidential ones, and was walking through a sort of a neighborhood with a friend of mine and said to these two old ladies sitting on the ground and selling vegetables, so are you planning on voting in the presidential elections? And the woman who was my friend she's a sort of an activist, and one of her goals is to get people to sort of understand the process and engage, etc. So the woman said, no, the military will decide the presidency. Now, this is a period of the SCAF. You could actually have thought that made some sense. And she said, no, we'll go to the polls, we'll vote. No, that doesn't happen. And as much as my friend was trying to convince her, the woman had the look of, the poor, pitiful woman. She was, it just doesn't happen. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's taking place, both, again, in processes and in terms of what's at stake. So essentially, when we think about it, we've got 4 types of people. We'll talk about sort of 3 or 4 of them, depending on the case in more detail. We have people who've essentially used to vote; they're still voting. We've got people who are not interested in voting at all, and people who are sort of new voters, right? And so essentially. This is one moment I wish I had my glasses on. Basically, about 50% of the people are new entrants. It's about 30% of the Egyptians. This is people who'd said that they'd voted before, and about 20% who hadn't. If you're looking in the Tunisian case, it's about 30% who are going to be new entrants, about 23% who are old voters. Again, that means people who said they voted prior. You get these no longer voters people. They're actually quite interesting. We're not going to talk about them as much as we might like, but those are people who are really frustrated with the revolution, i.e. they are people who I think, and given a lot of different ways you can correlate it, would be people you could say were the core supporters of the Ben Ali regime, essentially. Unfortunately, they're not the subject of our talk, but they're really interesting people. The subject of our talk, of course, is to understand what's changed, but in order to understand what's changed, I want to briefly give you a sense of what I think took place in terms of this relationship between clientelism and voting under authoritarian regimes. And I mean, the general notion is that authoritarian voting, or voting under authoritarian regimes, was never about changing who was in power. It was never about making sure that you sort of now got a really new economic policy, or that sort of the foreign policy in Egypt was suddenly going to overturn the peace treaty with Israel, which was pretty widely hated. None of those things were at stake. What people thought was at stake if you talked to them was that they wanted to be able to get somebody who, when they needed them to do something for them, they could actually have a bit more access than they could otherwise, okay? And for that to be useful to you, 2 things actually had to hold. One was that the person had to be essentially sort of useful enough or seen as having enough clout with regards to the regime that when they went and said, can you do something for me, it could be done. So you actually did care about whether or not the person you cared about whether or not the person had some degree of stature, and you certainly cared that they weren't going to be sitting there sort of, blustering in parliament and making themselves to be a pain. As one Jordanian once said, I voted for him last time, he's gone in, now they won't listen to him, I will never vote for him again, right? So those are the people you didn't want. But the other thing you wanted to make sure was that this was somebody who you were actually going to sort of, when you went to them and you said, I need you to help me get a job, or I need you to help me, get my child into a school, or I need you to do all of these things that are obviously partly being driven because these are non-transparent regimes with very little bureaucratic sort of, efficiency and rule of law issues. That when you went to that person, they were going to feel that for some reason they actually wanted to respond to you, right? Because they're going to get tons of these requests, and there had to be something about them and you that made them say, yes, and usually yes, khalti, which is yes, my aunt, I'll do this for you, right? In other words, that part ended up being, and I would argue it was driven less by did I vote for you in the last election, which is what we often think of it as, right? This is sort of a very Western perception. You vote for the guy, he then feels like he owes you. People tell you they don't think that's the way at all. They actually think that the person will help them because they wanted to be able to be assured that the person who they had a good relationship with was now in a position to help them. Right? It actually sort of turns the commitment problem on its head that we've always thought about as, how do I know that you're going to help me? The question was, how do I get the right person to be able to be placed well? So people tended to vote in areas where this was more likely, and that is they tended to vote in areas where they knew somebody, i.e. rural areas. They tended to vote if they were male. They tended to vote if they were older. People tended to be the ones who were out there voting. And as this was an earlier analysis I did with Tariq Massoud in Egypt on World Values Survey data, they tended to vote if they were somebody who was going to be an NDP supporter. Right? So they wanted to make sure that they had this kind of a link being established. But again, important to realize these links are being established in the context of these kinds of socially driven networks that are out there. The same thing under the Ben Ali regime, with the exception that this tended not to be necessarily people who were rural who end up voting. To be honest with you, it's not something I've quite entirely figured out, except that there is something about, first of all, there's more of these kind of shanty towns. There's more urban slum areas in Tunisia than there is in Egypt, and in many ways these dynamics seem to take place in both cases. But basically, you also saw less educated, more male voters going out. Now, what they didn't do that was different, and I think this is important, right? Because when we think about sort of the transition process, then all of a sudden there's this idea of, was it the Islamists in Egypt that were sitting it out and now are suddenly going to come in? In fact, a lot of discussions about whether or not, Egyptian voters would go for Islamists were based on a notion of what whether the people who sat it out and the people who actually voted were the same. The answer, I think, from what we're looking at is that they weren't that different, and in a wide range of ways. They don't have necessarily different concerns about what matters. They care about things like stability, etc. If you're looking at questions about Egypt today, they essentially sort of have the same preferences if you're talking about what's a good state model. And by the way, they tend to be very, about 30, almost 40% of the people think an Islamic state is the right model, whether they were people who voted for the NDP once at one point in time or didn't vote at the time. They also tend to sort of like, as you can tell, Saudi Arabia, something that's another discussion for another day. And the idea about how much influence religion should have on politics was about the same. So it wasn't, again, people, I would argue, were being drawn into voting because of the networks they were in. They weren't being drawn into voting because they somehow had a greater affinity for the regime. The same thing with regards to the Tunisian case. Again, you see that, attitudes towards things like religion and the state are roughly essentially the same, whether we're talking about new entrants or old voters. The no longer voters, of course, right, are actually a bit different. They're a bit more likely to think that religion shouldn't have a role to play in the state, which of course makes sense if you think of these as being part of the core voters out there. And again, fairly similar between new entrants and old voters on the question about whether or not democracy has its flaws, but it's the best system. Not a question, by the way, I happen to really like, but one that's out there. And when it comes down to actually voting, right, then we see that there's fairly similar in terms of who they're voting for. Old voters actually a bit more likely to vote for a Nahda, which I think is an interesting thing if you think, again, that people who were voting before under a very overtly, sort of secular regime, and in otherwise sort of distributed roughly the same. And in Egypt, actually, and here you're going to see a bit of work we still have left to do. But if you think the dark, kind of bluish purple are Islamist parties, right? The Noor party, which is seen as the Salafist party, and the FJP. Roughly the same distribution between Islamists and what we think of as secularists or non-Islamist parties. But then when you really look at it, you see that Noor actually gets a bigger bump among the old voters. And from what we've been able to ascertain so far, part of that is because the Noor was actually better at linking into these networks. It used to be the NDP networks to link into, but now they became, to some extent, networks that the Noor linked into, right? So the idea is that you just had essentially somewhat different, sources mobilizing them. So what difference does an uprising make? Has clientelism sort of changed, and how should we understand what's taking place today? To some extent, what we've looked at before has gotten to some of this, right? I mean, certainly it wasn't preferences that have changed. Something else has changed, and in a sense, sort of the question is, what is it? I would argue that the best way to think about this, right, is that, clientelism still plays a very major role. And if you look at the way, first of all, the way that campaigns are done, right, there's still a major emphasis, even in a campaign that was taking place in Tunisia, for a constituent assembly, the entire purpose of which was to write a constitution, right? Theoretically, that was what the constituent assembly was doing. I would ask voters before they went to the polls, do you think it's important if the candidate knows something about the law? And they'd say, why? Why should that be the case? You'd say, we go to the campaign events and you'd look at what they're talking about, and they were talking about, I'm from this area, I care about your services, I've contributed to you in these ways in the past, and I will continue to do so in the future. It was all still about service provision, linkages, emphasizing that you're one of them and I'm one of you. By the way, I'm not suggesting that this is anything particularly Middle Eastern. You look at half of the campaign material that comes through in your your mailboxes, and there's still great pictures of why people are sort of, we're all one and the same. But I think there was, again, there is a difference in terms of the extent to which you then only think that the person's going to help you because they do know you, and the ways in which that got emphasized. And people still very much emphasize that among the people, and this is, again, a little harder to demonstrate at the moment, but it seems to be among the people who would have voted before. In other words, that there are certain areas, and they tend to be rural areas, they tend to be sort of poor areas, that where people have thought in the modes of this is what an election is about, and it's not only, by the way, poor, but this is what an election is about, and therefore this is what I should be expecting. And that mindset doesn't change overnight. I've got to tell you the story about the Senate speaker in a moment, but I can't. It's totally offhand. So the second issue is that networks are still essentially kind of the major mobilizing force among, again, among a set of people. You ask people, did you go to more than one campaign event? No, they went to the one. You ask how many people, so I've done campaign studies in all these countries. You ask how many people here do you know? They know most of the people. Right? So these are small networks that are being mobilized much more than they are about individuals. And again, you see that vote decision making, especially among the old voters, still follows what I would argue is, this is going to be hard for you to be like, you have to sort of Rorschach test this one, okay? But it basically follows what I think of as following these kinds of interests. There's a set of people who, when they found their cousin was running, they knew they were voting for him, they didn't have to think further, right? That's the sort of this first 40%. And then there's a set of people who, they waited until they knew who was going to offer them the most on voting day, and that's who they voted for. Again, distinguish that from clientelism, but that is still another major part of what's going on within voting. So what's changed? I would argue again that networks are mobilized. There's sometimes different networks, but nevertheless they're being mobilized. So we saw ex-NDP people didn't do so well in the last elections, and people hooted and hollered about that. But then what you saw instead was the fact that was because now somebody who couldn't have been sort of running in the last election was now running in the election. Candidates, again, from influential families and social networks would sometimes now be running more than one campaign, or they would run for more than one party, and people would say, that shows clientelism isn't working. No, actually what it showed was the networks still worked. They just didn't have the cohesion of keeping it together in a world where all of a sudden you could sort of open up to more candidates. They can talk to the Jordanians. They did it the same way. Now the tribes actually hold tribal primaries. They've found ways essentially to coordinate and avoid those kinds of problems. But it didn't mean in either of these cases that the social networks weren't operating. It simply meant that they found times when their interests were diverging. Previous voters, though, I think, people who had not been voting before participated. A lot of times, now, if you ask those people, a lot of times they're going to more than one kind of campaign. They're out and sort of deciding much later who they're going to vote for, but not on sort of on election day. Right? There is a set of people who are now being mobilized, and of course, you know this from the democracies literature, right? We get programmatic parties and clientelistic parties. People think of them in those terms, but basically, there's a set of people who've now been brought in who are not interested in thinking of it in terms of what my network is, and not interested in necessarily only knowing who can help them at the end of the day, but are actually interested in thinking about what kind of a state do I want, what kinds of policies do I want, et cetera. So in a sense, I would argue that we have at least two electoral logics, and I think it's probably fair to say that there's more than that all of a sudden are coming to the fore. It's not clientelism hasn't been subverted, the social networks haven't been sort of beaten down, but rather there's another sort of game that's being played at the same time. So the challenges, if you think that you want to sort of move towards programmatic Western parties, and actually, by the way, I keep getting beaten down at Strauss events, but I'm not entirely sure that there's not costs that we don't pay attention to when you're making these kinds of changes, right? We're also talking about atomized societies where people are less likely to help each other on an entire other sets of levels. But essentially, we need to recognize that, you want to maintain the participation of those who are voting for other reasons, right? If you think that that's an important thing. And by the way, those are the people who are getting frustrated more quickly. The old voters are much more favorable towards the government institutions and all of the, in both Tunisia and in Egypt than they are in the non-voters were, or the new voters were. You want to build more powerful institutions. That's not entirely surprising. You want to reduce these reasons that people actually sort of need a parliamentarian or need somebody to do something else for them, right? I mean, so it's a basic rule of law, but it's also things like, merit exams and civil service exams, right? Which I think, frankly, are probably worth, every dollar spent on those, this is my own entirely unspecified opinion, is probably worth, is worth 10 that's spent on party strengthening, as long as you haven't changed essentially what the game is that's being played. There you have it. That's the view of the Middle East, which is a totally different perspective than this. But.
Thank you very much, Ellen. Before I open it up to discussion, I just want to add 2 comments of my own from my current project. I'm trying to figure out when warlords become state builders, based on a book that I did this past year on warlordism, and I'm looking particularly at the case of Palestinian security forces. And I have a partial answer to what Gulnaz and Scott said about why is it that everybody takes Europe as being the model and expects things to evolve. It's because Europe evolved. Europe was originally based on, not originally, but throughout the Middle Ages was based on informal patronage networks, and Europe evolved into a state-building system. And so one of the things that I argue is that people pay far too much attention to the European model, so I agree with you on that. But the reason they do is that Europe did make that path. And the second thing is that from the research that I've done, the indication is that in the vast majority of cases where a rule-based system has emerged into statehood, it was based on a rule-based tribal system or a rule-based local political system beforehand, and most systems never went through this intermediate period of warlordism and force-based patronage. And so Europe, continental Western Europe, was actually the exception. And the reason that we have so many cases in the world today where you have force-based patronage, including in some of the Middle East cases, seems to have an awful lot to do with imperialism and outside forces, in many cases the Ottomans and the British, sending in money and sending in weapons that completely disrupted traditional social networks. And so therefore you didn't get the move from traditional social networks to consensual-based, rule-based states. But we don't really have very good evidence outside of the West European continental model that anything that is currently based on an informal, force-based system is going to evolve. And so that's one of the puzzles that I'm dealing with, but at least that's sort of a partial response to the things that you said. So now let's open it up. And when you ask a question, please identify yourself and remember that we are all on the record. Austin, why don't you go first?
Hi, Austin Long. I'm an assistant professor here. I had a question primarily for Scott, but anybody can take a crack at it. So we think of these pyramids or networks as sort of being inside a particular nation state, but the example you gave of Osh, part of the reason Osh can have this weird autonomy is because there's trade routes, both licit and illicit, that run from Tajikistan up through Osh into Uzbekistan. So clearly at least some of these networks have to either transcend nation-state boundaries or have to cut deals with the pyramid on the other side of the border. So could you talk to that a little bit? How do we think about that kind of either transnational or alliances across the boundaries between these groups?
Should I take that now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there have to be some resources that are worth congealing, cohering around. And in the case of Osh, you're right, a large part of the local economy is based on the drug trade. Drugs transit from Afghanistan and then through Tajikistan and usually Kyrgyzstan as well. So in the case of Osh in particular, yes, that is where a lot of the money is coming from. But that doesn't have to be the case in a state that has sufficient resources of its own, like, say, Kazakhstan, where there's plentiful energy resources. Of course, the revenues are coming from abroad because that's where they're selling it, that enter the country. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an external pyramid that's supporting an internal pyramid, but the revenues do have to come from somewhere. And as an additional point, which is only partly related, I was talking actually to Alexander Cooley earlier, and he's looking at how Central Asian elites use offshore banks to stash their money. And so there's an additional element here, which is that since you can't trust the local institutions to keep your money safe, you of course send it offshore where you can feel more secure about it. So obviously there are other things at play. You can take a global view of what's going on. But it still helps to know what the shape of these networks is, right, that are seeking and extracting and securing these resources.
Yes.
I'm Bob Reese. I'm an author who lives in the neighborhood. And I'm not sure if this is a stupid question.
There are no stupid questions.
But really,
that's
there
what
are
professors
stupid
always
questions.
say.
And this might be it. Anyway, I'm wondering, what are the flaws that are built into the social science system that trap social scientists and make you unable to break out of the system and analyze something fresh, even when you know that the system is flawed?
Oh, you mean in terms of the comments that were made about it's
yeah,
wrong to focus on states, and yet everybody does anyway.
There's a pervasive criticism of your own methods, and if you know that the methods are flawed, why isn't there some other way of, I don't know, conducting studies?
If I can just,
Do you want to take this?
I know since I started with this complaint, but I just see it sort of as a, since science is done through language, and language is, developing, and I guess also, especially language of political science scholarship, is dependent on who is creating it, and who is creating it. There's usually the countries that are more developed and that have the luxury of subsidizing, our intellectual activities, right? So there is some natural logic to it, but I was just trying to point out that to a certain extent we are constrained by the language that we have created, and we are making efforts to, sort of be cognizant of it and to come up with new concepts and new ways of looking at these processes from other perspectives rather than from, it's a flawed democracy or not working state. Well, it's a working network. It's a working, patron-client relationship. And yet, I was trying to point out that it's, still the power of political science language that has been dominated by the Western concept is very strong.
Follow up, just quick.
There are a lot of people who have questions.
Sorry.
I think we're going to go on to them. Frederick in the back.
Hi there, Frederick Schoberg, a postdoc at Harriman Institute. I'd love to continue on the same point, kind of a methodological question, but beyond conceptual issues. It seems like there's two quite different traditions represented by the panelists here. We have survey research that's trying to capture voting behavior, but also clientelistic things that are difficult to measure. And we have a slightly different approach, it seems, based on the presentations from Gulnaz and Scott. I'd love a bit of a cat fight on that in terms of what kind of methodological approach would be good to ask some of these questions that, for instance, Scott posed. And if you who aren't doing survey research think that there's any sense in asking questions about clientelistic behavior in surveys.
Maybe Scott, you could talk about your methods and what you do.
Sure. So I'm afraid I won't give you a cat fight, Frederick, as much as you'd like that. I think the kinds of things I talked about doesn't presuppose any methodology. It probably requires a little bit more sleuthing to figure out how things work in non-transparent societies, but that doesn't also mean you can't use more conventional methodologies, like going through newspapers and gathering pieces of data about who's in power, where they came from, and what region they came from, and what universities they attended, and try to figure out how people are connected. Interviews are helpful. Old-fashioned interviewing, which is still a political science methodology, can be useful. People might not always tell you the truth. You have to be a little bit more clever in figuring out how things work. But people who've spent some time in these countries sort of get a feel for how to do that kind of thing, although it's very, very difficult. And I wouldn't exclude surveys either from trying to get a handle on some of these things. The questions might not be so simple and I would say crude as the World Values Survey's questions, but there may be ways of crafting questions and targeting them at people in ways that help you triangulate how things are going on. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if other people want to.
If I can just add that I think the difference is not so much methodological that you're pointing out, but it's a difference of attention. Mm-hmm. I think I and Scott are looking into the elite level sort of power networks here versus Ellen is looking into voting mobilization and what type of social logic or political logic that's behind why voters go to vote and who they vote for. So we're looking at different things here on the top versus on the bottom. Methodology.
The only thing I would add, and it's again, you won't get a fight the other way either, unfortunately, but because I think the kinds of things that at the elite level that you were talking about, they can't be done with these methods. I mean, it would be very difficult to imagine it. The one thing I could imagine doing is being able to say, okay, we think that when we've got this set of when we've got an umbrella system, right, or versus when we have I didn't like your age distribution, by the way. That's okay. Yeah. But depending on what different systems, then we think that these are the implications either for how people are mobilized at the bottom, right, or how services are provided, or who to what extent you get distribution of welfare or other sort of local outcomes of this, and then you could actually go back, I think, in very interesting ways and say, okay, I think we've got this system in this area, right? I mean, I loved your example, right, where you think, okay, here's what was going on within the sort of the elite sort of informal networks in one area versus another, and here's what we thought went on with regards to the electoral competition and how it worked itself out. But you could imagine electoral competition is one thing, you could imagine service provision is another thing, and those you could actually then say, okay, I'm going to take it as given that I'm right about what these networks varieties look like, and I want to go in and I want to see, was I right about who got services or who didn't get services, and then you can actually marry sort of surveys at the local level with these kinds of analyses.
If I can just put my 2 cents in, Frederick, my answer would be that the questions drive the methods, and it's always a mistake if the methods drive the questions.
Good.
Yes. I'm Janara Namuzbaeva, postdoc here at Harriman. I thought that I have questions for all three of you. First, for Gulnaz and Scott, I thought that it was really fascinating to see how your questions are being driven by the fields, and I thought that it was really great that you're really crafting your questions by your I guess field work, and I wanted to see how does that in return shape. How does it contribute to bigger questions that political science is doing? I mean, it's a big question, but I'm just curious how you see that information coming in from that region, shaping, I guess, bigger questions. And for Ellen, I thought that just the fact that the way voters see their candidates, as doing all these things for them. I'm just curious, do the candidates actually perform these services for voters? Oh, great.
So I think the question was really about the theory contribution to theory from fieldwork, and from my own studies, I tried to think that I have contributed to the analysis of how political economic systems evolve, and I've tried to sort of conceptualize it so that sort of politics and economy are not really separate spheres, but I talked about institutional orders within which formal and informal institutions coexist, and sometimes they become incompatible, and so there is a friction and change emerging, right? So it's not very original idea, and yet when you sort of theorizing about informal institutions and formal institutions side by side was pretty new in the early 2000s, so I thought that it was interesting. And then with regard to crony capitalism concept, usually, again, the concept wasn't very old at all. I think it really came into being sometime after the Asian financial crisis, when all of a sudden our developmental states that were really successful, because they went through the crisis, they turned into crony capitalism. Crony capitalism explained everything, right? And then there were research into economic aspects, implications of crony capitalism. I tried to bring attention to political, because crony capitalism is not just it's obviously combines political economic spheres, and I tried to look at how such cronyism does not only, so I didn't look at the economic side, I looked at the political side, sort of political consequences of crony capitalism could be studied on those cases, I thought.
So I'll speak a little bit more generally about political science. I think what we're doing is not necessarily that marginal to the field as a whole. So it was useful to kick around political science in order to introduce what we do, but there are a lot of people who are taking authoritarianism seriously. Political science adapts pretty quickly to the changing times, and so transitology is out, and it's been out for some time now. And so you don't find as many people as before who start from the assumption of a linear trajectory to a democratic future. That's very rare these days. So now people are starting to take seriously some of the things that would have been dismissed before. And so there's this new line of research that looks at authoritarian institutions and authoritarian stability from mostly a rational choice perspective. And I think that could actually be balanced and would gain a lot by taking a more sociological view. And I think there's room for that to happen. Political science is also very adaptable and eager to borrow from other fields. So I'm optimistic about that. I think so. The field is amorphous enough that it can include all of this.
Although especially economics.
It's going more in that direction.
Right. So do people always get what they want? Not as often as they wish, right? So one of the things that you'll hear people say is, and I remember very vividly that this woman said, I voted for him. I was so excited. Finally, we actually got somebody elected from our tribe. It was a minor tribe that had actually opposed King Hussein in Jordan in like the 60s, and then been basically shut out for a very long time. And then he didn't do anything for us, right? So you'll get a lot of frustration. A lot of people feel like they didn't, but they also don't think that somebody else would do better for them. They don't think that going to a complete stranger was going to be more useful. They're just frustrated that the person that they go to doesn't always help them. Now, about 5%, and this was before and after the ruptures in Tunisia, go and actually ask an MP for assistance, which in a sense, it doesn't seem huge. But on the other hand, if you realize, that's actually probably more than, I think, the percentage of Americans who've actually contacted a congressman and asked for some kind of an assistance, right? It's a pretty high number. So people do think of this as a path. It's not the only path to trying to get help, but they think of it as a path. It doesn't always work, but they think they're going to have a better chance of it working if they got the right person there than if they've got the wrong person there. And in that sense, it kind of keeps things going. I also want to just note briefly, again, this can change over time. It changes when economic situations are hard and all of a sudden there's fewer jobs to be given out to begin with, or when things get difficult. At this moment, I would argue is one of the reasons why the Jordanian regime should actually be very concerned. I just got back from doing a study mission on the Jordanian elections, is the fact that people very much, people even who have been mobilized and have gone and spent the entire day sitting in a tent, this is a group of women, because they're going to they were mobilized by the candidate. They don't expect it's going to do anything for them. They expected they were going to get, as one person said, I'm at least going to make today count. So there's other things that are getting people out, of which one is just sort of hard cold cash, right? But the expectations are not as often met as maybe everybody would like.
Yes. I have a question about the properties.
Who are you?
I'm sorry. I'm Sveta Petrova, and I'm a visiting fellow in the Harriman. I wondered, we talked a little bit about the centralization of the system of networks versus their multipolarity. We also talked about the shape of the networks. So I wondered, what other properties of these networks do you think are consequential in terms of their relationship to the political regime and the state institutions they inhabit? And the second question I have for Professor Ratnitz, you talked about cycles of consolidation and decentralization and then episodic assertions of social forces. And so it's, in a way, you're describing a lot of cycles. I wondered if those network cycles have any relationship to other important cycles we talk about, like election cycles, social movement cycles, etc. And then relatedly, I wondered what events or processes offset or begin a cycle and then conclude the cycle.
Say it again.
Sort of what sets a cycle in motion,
right,
and then what closes the cycle down.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think I can just add some of the really good questions that Scott raise, in addition to my attention to the coexistence of multiple networks versus the centralized networks, and the fluidity, the stability issue that I've also addressed. I think the issue of under which conditions they revive, how long they exist, how they change, how they come back. It's more of a rather abstract issue right now, so I think I will need some time to think about, okay, what else is politically consequential. I think the issue, what I thought was politically consequential, I talked about.
So this is definitely food for thought, so I'll give you the best that I got now. About the properties of networks. When networks are studied in sociology and to some extent in political science, typically scholars look at the structure of those networks. They look at nodes and network centrality and distance, density. And I think this is the kind of research you can do when you have really good data. But I was mostly talking about the content of networks, who the people are, where they come from, how they're connected, and what kinds of ends they seek. That doesn't mean that structure isn't important. It probably is. But in order to get there, you have to be able to map things out to an extent that's difficult to do with the data we have available. There's at least one project going on, though, that involves gathering data on Russian elites over a long period of time. I think it's going on here. And I think if that data set is complete, right, there might be a way to apply some of this more structural logic to it. For the time being, though, the only, I guess you could call it structure, the only dynamic part that I'm interested in is to look at the relative power distribution among the networks that you can identify. About your second question, cycles. The cycles concept is kind of striking because, the old paradigm was linear. Things are one way, things will become a different way, and that'll be it forever. And yet, people who've been following post-Soviet politics have to be struck by how often things that we thought weren't going to happen again, happen again. There was mass mobilization in the early 90s, then there was nothing for a long time, then there were the color revolutions, then that stopped, and then there were the protests against Putin last year, which is pretty shocking. That did coincide with an election, but there were no protests to speak of in the previous, how many elections? A lot. So you can try to chart some of these things by other events that are happening, and there might be other things that I'm not thinking of. So, the rise of the middle class is something, maybe economic shocks might have something to do with it, but then, and there were labor protests in 98, 99, at the same time as there was the worldwide financial crisis. So maybe Gulnaz can finish my thought.
Maybe another analytical, possibility that I didn't discuss and I don't think Scott really touched on is also the study of not just a single network and multiple networks, but the types of relationships within networks and between networks, and to what extent these relationships could make for a more stable order or unstable order. Again, if we, so if there is some cooperation and some collusions among networks versus a more competitive relationship and how that changes, and so sort of this idea of that networks coexist with other networks and relate to each other. I think that relationship point we didn't quite cover, and I would probably think that it would be consequential.
It's also interesting, when we're talking about elections and resulting protests, all the people who were studying color revolutions saw these as electoral protests. They all happened in and around and in response to elections. So that seemed to be significant. Then there was the Arab Spring. It had nothing to do with elections, right?
Actually, it did, but that's
did
the
it?
definition.
Oh.
I think you could make an argument, but yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Sorry.
In Kyrgyzstan,
But it's seen as not, you're right.
In Kyrgyzstan, there was mass mobilization in 2010, overthrew Bakiev. No election in sight. It was 2 years earlier. So again, once we think we identify a pattern, then something new happens, which refutes that.
Is part of the answer that things are not monocausal, and that when you get sudden disruptions, it's because a whole variety of factors come together. Right, that right. It's essentially I don't know what the proper terminology is. There's probably someone in the audience who does, but that it's cumulative rather than
That could very well be the case.
And the point about election is not that it's a cause, but it's the an event that allows.
And I have a question for Scott. Your notion, right, of sort of the cycles is not one that starts. I mean, this is, in a sense, don't we expect that we see cycles everywhere? And how do we decide the difference between a cycle versus that there's stochastic events that occur, and they occur with some probability all the time? And so I guess I'm just curious how you distinguish a cycling versus sort of a random chance and a random probability, and that over time that looks, if it's about 20% of the time, it looks about every 20 years. I mean, it's...
No, you're right, you're right. I think I wasn't referring to any rhythmic regularity that we could know, and there hasn't been enough time to us, even if there was such a thing, so no.
But why does it start at, like, when you say it hasn't been enough time, isn't this something that should actually go back? Is there anything specific about the current period that should be different than the decades before it?
Well, the Soviet period. I mean,
why? But I mean, like, what's the difference? What's the I don't mean that suddenly monopoly. What's the underlying difference, though?
Well, the opportunity structure in the Soviet Union was completely different. Politics weren't as fluid. There weren't as many opportunities for people to make any assertion for power.
Working?
There are different kinds of networks.
Decentralization in the Soviet period.
I don't want to take over the panel with this question, but I do have a question about this, which is that formal theorists argue that the only way that you get change in a system is if the incentive structure is based on the interests of people who had power in the previous system, right? And so that means that somehow the system that we got in the post-Soviet space had to come out of the Soviet space, and the Soviet space had to come out of what came before in terms of who had the interests that were involved. And so if the argument that you're making is that the networks have this certain stability over time because they keep on reappearing, at some point you must be able to trace back the networks and say the same networks that are there today have a relationship to the networks that were there in the imperial era. Or if not, some kind of a shock to the system must have changed which networks came out on top.
Which gets you to a question, which gets you to a part of the answer to the question, when do they survive and when do they get entirely obliterated?
Agreed. These are all very valid, interesting questions.
Start in the imperial era and end today and say what happened to the networks over all those times and why, and what does that say about evolution, and what can we say about generalizable theories that might apply to the Middle East and the fact that we see networks coming and going in the Middle East? What can we say are the causal factors?
For that, we need to compare probably a Central Asian country with like a Baltic country, not within the Central Asian so much, because we do have such a re-emergence of the Soviet nomenclature networks versus sort of a complete purge in the countries that have joined Europe, where communists were not allowed. So I think there could be some, what is it called, the cleansing off from the parties. What's it term?
Illustration?
Not illustration.
Illustration,
yeah,
right.
illustration. The degree to which illustration, for example, occurred could. I mean, if we talk about the reappearance of networks versus their sort of disappearance.
And networks have been traced back to the Soviet era. So late Brezhnev, early Gorbachev, and there was a lot of turnover, but there was also some continuity. And so people who study Central Asia, at least, can trace a lot of what happened in the 90s and even today to what happened under Gorbachev, when there was some change in elites at the republic level. So this is all traceable. And if you want to go back far enough, right, you could find probably interesting patterns, right, of continuity that occurs over time, even when you might assume there would have been a clean break. I agree with that.
Yes.
Without you by a giant assistant professor. Well, I was wondering about how all the systems of impersonal informal networks fits with this multicultural, multinational backgrounds in all your cases. And I suppose this is my question for all three panelists. I mean, Russia is so multinational. Kazakhstan, there's probably the second very striking example. Scott just mentioned this Osh conflict, where precisely that also demonstrated this interplay of how this, cut across these personal informal networks, cut across this ethnic division. So I was wondering about, for example, the role of Russians in Kyrgyzstan, because there's also significant percentage of Russian populations, and as well as, for example, especially in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is a very interesting example, and indeed Russia. So how this elite networking and also elite, but also local networking, how this national factor plays off? Is it some kind of sensitivity or tension?
What's the role of ethnic?
All right, ethnic factor in creation of this operation of these informal networks.
I can just quickly say that in Russian regions, you definitely see the role of the ethnic factor. No wonder Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Tuva were frequently referred to as ethnocracies because they were seen as republics, sort of the homelands for specific ethnic groups. The power was sort of in the hands of of that titular group, in the hands of Tatars for the most part, or Tuvans, and so you do have ethnic factor there. But once that is sort of one picture, then there is also specific family linkages that could be found, right? And sometimes non-family networks, but frequently just of that ethnic group. So there are different logics. And then also under Putin, these networks, or at least the top representative of these networks, were sort of well embedded into the larger. So in the Politburo slide that I showed, the head of the Tatar network was one of the strong regional leaders who is seen as being in the national network. So ethnic factor does play a role, but does not preclude situations when these ethnic leaders are in the national network.
And I would say it's hard to generalize because in some cases ethnicity plays a greater role, in some cases it plays a lesser role. In southern Kyrgyzstan, certainly politics tends to be organized along ethnic lines. But you find other cases where network competition takes place within a single ethnic group. And in fact, the single bloodiest conflict that occurred out of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the Tajik Civil War, which was a war of Tajiks against Tajiks. But they tended to be organized along regional lines. So their ethnicity was not a factor, and yet led to fierce competition.
So it was pre-existing organizational structures that came out of the old system that determined whether ethnicity mattered.
Whether it's in the Tajik case or in general?
Well, when you're contrasting the Tajik case with the Kyrgyz case.
Kyrgyzstan is more complicated, though, because a lot of stuff happened in the interim. I think ethnicity wasn't, as big of a role in informal politics up until the end of the Akayev era, and it became kind of intensified in the Bakiyev era because of perceived favoritism toward southern ethnic Kyrgyz, which then kind of laid the stage for the violence that occurred in 2010.
So if I can push you, can we generalize and say there's certain causal factors that are involved with the emergence of ethnic networks and other causal
There are
factors?
certain and probably many causal factors involved.
This goes back to a little bit to both Posner's earlier work and also work that Andrei Bealunis has done. I mean, there's also this question about taking ethnicity as a given versus, or taking any of these groups as a given versus recognizing as well that they can be, shaped and reshaped. So, what we see in this is Bealunis' argument with regards to Lebanon and also with Jordan, that there's a kind of a recreation that's going on even along terms of sort of family and kinship. Suddenly, you were in my family. You didn't know it, but now we're in the family, and we both construct this as a reasonable understanding of our past, because it does mean that we sort of have increased. Essentially, we've allied, right? We've formed an alliance that we then take forward. So, I think we have to be careful about taking it as a given. It doesn't mean, of course, that those historical experiences don't also shape where you are today. So the other example that comes from my region, I think that's useful to think about, is that historically the East Bank Jordanians have been much more strongly organized in terms of tribal lines and have had that as a very sort of strong mobilizing factor, even down to the point where they have tribal names on lists, and they use them for get out the vote efforts on election day the same way that you would any other kind of list of supporters. And whereas the Palestinian Jordanians don't have this, they sometimes feel affinity with each other because they're from the same, I'm from Bethlehem or I'm from Ramallah or whatever. They feel from the same place or sometimes in the same family, but they don't have these big, organized networks. They don't do the same kinds of things. So it is interesting that in the same place, it's not just that ethnicity can play a role in terms of a marker, but that there can also be very different sort of degrees of social organization within them that can operate.
And my understanding is that even within Palestine, in Hebron, you have much stronger tribal connections than you do anywhere else in the West Bank.
Yep. And Hebronese, by the way, in Jordan also still have tribes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question? Anybody?
Just as a continuation, can it be considered the outcome of this imperial, Western imperial colonizing engineering, or how do you see this? How can you explain this difference between these tribal identities which are more pronounced in certain parts of the Arab world and less pronounced and less shaped and reshaped in others? Is it good?
It's the same thing with chiefdoms in sub-Saharan Africa as well, right? I mean, so I don't know that you would say that it's only the outcome, right? But there's certainly, both the extent to which these maintain a coherence and actually have meaning in terms of we can combine and make a decision that sort of feels binding to the group versus we can say anything you want and it doesn't feel binding. That seems to have at least been strengthened or weakened by colonial experiences, again, in sub-Saharan Africa and also in the Middle East. And the other thing I would note, which I think is very interesting, is, so again, you're going to get lots of Jordan stories because this has just happened, but basically, someone today is explaining that the reason that they have one seat in their constituency, right, is because when the British were ruling and came in Jordan, that the British preferred the other tribes, and therefore that the state has always had a better relationship with the other tribes, and they have sort of a one-seat constituency, and it fragments the tribe because they then fight over the seat, etc. But it's very interesting, right? I mean, so it's not just a question of did it matter, but also it's very present in people's minds that the way we understand our disadvantage with the state today is how the British ruled us, 60-some years ago.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Gulnaz, Scott, and Ellen for a great panel.